Captain James Kowalski stood in the operations tent at Nui Dat in the autumn of 1967 and listened to the Australian liaison officer explain why the American approach to jungle warfare was fundamentally, irredeemably, catastrophically wrong, with the serene confidence of a man who had never watched what a properly employed M60 machine gun does to a Viet Cong ambush line at close range. The Australian was a major named Hartley from the 1st Australian Task Force, a lean, deliberate man who wore his slouch hat with the left brim pinned up and spoke the way people speak when they have decided that economy of language is a virtue and enthusiasm is a liability. He had been in Phuc Tuy province for 9 months. He knew the jungle, or so he said, the way a priest knows a cathedral. Every shadow, every sound, every place where the light fell wrong. Kowalski had been in Vietnam for 4 months. He had done a year in Germany before that, maintaining tanks that never moved anywhere interesting. And before Germany, he had gone through the Infantry Officer Basic course at Fort Benning and the Ranger course and an 18-month assignment at Fort Hood that had given him an intimate familiarity with Texas heat and very little else of operational value. He was 26 years old. He had been in a firefight exactly twice, both times in the previous 4 months, both times outcomes that he considered satisfactory. Hartley was explaining that the correct approach to the long, high hills was patience. Careful, methodical, deliberate patience. You did not go into the long, high hills with firepower. You went in with small patrols, 4 or 5 men, who moved so slowly that the jungle accepted them the way the jungle accepted rain, as something natural, something that belonged. You watched. You listened. You built a picture of the enemy so complete and so precise that when you finally acted, the action was surgical and decisive and produced no unnecessary disturbance to the intelligence environment you had so carefully constructed. Kowalski looked at the map of the long high hills. Then he looked at the after-action reports from Australian patrols in that area over the previous 3 months. Then he looked at Hartley. "Sir," he said, "how many confirmed kills in the long high hills in the last 90 days? Hartley's expression did not shift in any way that was visible to the naked eye, but something happened behind it. The SAS patrols in that area have located 4 supply caches, mapped 17 kilometers of previously unknown trail network, identified 2 battalion-level base camp locations, and developed an intelligence picture that will enable confirmed kills, sir," Kowalski said. "Enemy personnel eliminated." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to become meaningful. 11 confirmed. Possibly 17. Kowalski looked at the map again. The long, high hills were marked in red grease pencil. The D445 Viet Cong Battalion operated in that area. Estimated strength, 400 to 500 fighters. 3 months of patient Australian SAS methodology had produced 11 confirmed kills against an enemy force of 500. In the same period, Kowalski said, choosing his tone the way you choose your footing on a stream crossing, carefully, with attention to what was underneath. The 173rd Airborne in the adjacent province conducted 14 search and destroy operations. 143 confirmed kills, 32 American KIA. And how many of those 143 kills were confirmed combatants versus civilian casualties misattributed as all of them, sir? Every one of them went through the after-action process. Every one of them was verified. Kowalski kept his voice level. I'm not disputing the intelligence value of what the SAS has produced. I'm asking whether 11 kills in 90 days against a 500-man battalion
is an acceptable rate of attrition. Hartley lit a cigarette. He smoked it the way Australians smoked, without apparent urgency, as if the cigarette were a small problem requiring quiet management rather than an activity. "You're measuring the wrong thing, Captain. The objective is not body count."
The objective is understanding the enemy well enough to defeat him decisively. "The objective," Kowalski said, "is to stop the D445 battalion from attacking civilian infrastructure, mining roads, and killing provincial reconstruction workers. Understanding them is a means to that end. It is not the end itself." Hartley looked at him with the expression of a school teacher whose most promising student has just made an elementary error. "Captain, I've been operating in this jungle for 9 months. The American approach, noise, firepower, aggressive contact, it doesn't work here. It worked in Europe. It worked in Korea. This jungle is different. This enemy is different. You cannot—" "Sir." Kowalski had not intended to interrupt a field-grade officer twice in one conversation. He was interrupting twice in one conversation. "With respect, the kill ratio argument works both ways. 11 kills in 90 days tells me the patient methodology is not working either. It's producing intelligence. It's not producing results." Hartley smoked and looked at the map and said nothing for long enough that Kowalski began to wonder whether he had made a career-ending miscalculation. Then Hartley said, "Come with me on the next patrol." It was not an offer. It was not a challenge exactly. It was the particular kind of invitation that contains within it the assumption of the inviter's eventual vindication. The invitation of a man who is confident that direct experience will prove his argument more effectively than any amount of discussion. "Accepted," Kowalski said. What Kowalski did not know, could not have known from his 4 months in Vietnam and his reading of the intelligence assessments and his conversations with officers who had been in country longer than he had, was that Hartley was right about some things. The Australian SAS methodology was genuinely extraordinary at certain functions. It was patient in a way that produced intelligence that American methods could not replicate. It was stealthy in a way that allowed small elements to operate deep in enemy territory and return with information that changed the operational picture. But Hartley was also wrong about some things. Not wrong in the way that incompetent people are wrong, from ignorance or laziness. Wrong in the way that highly competent people are sometimes wrong, from the accumulated certainty of expertise applied past its appropriate boundary. He had been so successful with the patient methodology in so many situations that he had stopped checking whether the patient methodology was the right tool for every situation. He had confused the methodology with the answer. Kowalski had not yet identified this precisely. He had identified it as a feeling, the specific feeling of watching someone demonstrate competence at the wrong task with great enthusiasm. He would spend the next 10 days turning that feeling into something he could articulate. The patrol inserted on a Tuesday. 6 Australians and Kowalski, moving out from the Nui Dat perimeter at 0500 in single file. Kowalski third in the order of march, behind a sergeant named Calloway, who moved through the jungle with the specific silence of a man who had spent years practicing it. Kowalski had been on patrols. He had moved through jungle before, but the Australian pace was something outside his previous experience. Not because it was faster than he could manage, but because it was so much slower than anything he had been trained to consider operationally viable. 3 steps. Pause. Listen. 3 steps. Pause. They covered 200 meters in the first 30 minutes. At that rate, Kowalski calculated, they would reach the first objective, a suspected trail junction 4 kilometers into the long high hills, in approximately 10 hours. His ranger school training told him that a patrol should cover that distance in under 2 hours in standard jungle conditions. He said nothing. He had agreed to observe the methodology, and he was going to observe it. By mid-morning, they had covered approximately 1 kilometer. Calloway stopped the patrol 6 times for halts that lasted between 5 minutes and 40 minutes. During the longest halt, Kowalski heard nothing. He saw nothing. After 38 minutes, Calloway signaled the patrol to move, and they had detoured around something that Kowalski still could not identify. At the first rest stop, crouched in cover so dense the sky was invisible, Kowalski whispered to Calloway, "What were we detouring around at the last halt?" Calloway turned and looked at him with the flat assessment of a professional evaluating whether an answer would be useful. "Smell," he said. "Cigarette smoke. Old. Maybe 2 days. Trail that way." He pointed into the undergrowth without pointing, a direction indicated by something subtler than a gesture. Kowalski sniffed the air. He could not smell cigarette smoke. He could not smell anything except the green, rotting, alive smell of jungle that had been his ambient atmosphere for 4 months and had long since stopped registering as information. "You could smell a 2-day-old cigarette," Kowalski said. "Bloke smoked a lot," Calloway said. That was the end of the conversation. On the second day, they found a trail. Not the trail junction they had been moving toward, but a different trail, unmarked on any map, running east to west through terrain that the topographic analysis had designated as impassable. Hartley spent 20 minutes examining it without touching it. He photographed it with a camera that made no sound. He sketched it in a notebook. Then he signaled the patrol to move away from it and continue north. They did not set an ambush. They did not follow the trail to identify its terminus. They noted it and moved on. Kowalski wrote in his own notebook that evening. Day 2. Trail located, documented, not exploited. Estimated Viet Cong usage, daily or more frequent based on vegetation disturbance. Decision, record and continue. My assessment, missed opportunity for contact or, at minimum, trail denial. He did not show the notebook to Hartley. On the third day, they observed a Viet Cong resupply column moving along the trail they had found. 11 men carrying loads, moving at a pace that suggested familiarity with the route, comfortable, not cautious, not expecting contact. The patrol watched from 30 meters. 11 men with weapons and supplies, moving in the open, at close range, in daylight. The patrol did not engage. Kowalski watched the column pass with the specific physical effort of a man who is overriding a trained response. Everything in his infantry training said, engage. The enemy was in the open. The range was workable. The element of surprise was complete. A 6-man ambush at 30 meters against 11 men carrying loads would have been decisive and would have been over in under 30 seconds. The patrol watched them pass and did not move. After the column was gone, after Hartley had given it 40 minutes of quiet and then signaled the patrol to hold another 20 minutes after that, Kowalski moved to where Hartley was crouched and whispered with the specific compression of a man who has a great deal to say and is limiting himself to the essential. 11 men, 30 meters. Why didn't we engage? Hartley looked at him. Because engaging tells the D445 we're here. They change their routes. They go to ground. We lose the intelligence picture we're building. We also miss 11 kills and a resupply interdiction. We gain continued access to an uncompromised route that will show us where those supplies are going.
Sir, where they're going is to fighters who will use them to attack people. Where they're going, Hartley said, with the patience of a man who has had this argument before and won it every time, is to a base camp that we do not yet have located. When we locate that base camp, we call in the rifle companies, and they destroy it completely. 11 kills now, or potentially 150 kills in 3 weeks when we know exactly where the battalion is concentrated. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. The argument was sound. He could not dispute the logic of it. What he could dispute was the premise. The premise was that the patrol would locate the base camp within a timeline that justified letting 11 armed enemy fighters walk through a 30-meter ambush.
The premise was that patience would be rewarded with a decisive opportunity before the operational cost of that patience became prohibitive. He did not articulate this. He went back to his position and wrote in his notebook and waited. On the 5th day, something happened that Hartley's methodology had not anticipated and was not designed to handle. The patrol was in a holding position at 0700 when the jungle to the south erupted. Not the gradual escalation of a developing contact, but the sudden, full-volume detonation of a large element making contact at close range. Heavy machine gun fire, AK-47s, what sounded like at least one RPG. The sound was coming from approximately 800 meters south-southeast, which put it inside the area of operations of a platoon from the 5th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment that was conducting a sweep operation in coordination with the 1st Task Force. The rifle platoon had walked into an ambush. Hartley's response was immediate and correct within the framework of his methodology. He moved the patrol to a position where they could observe the likely Viet Cong withdrawal routes, intending to gather intelligence on enemy strength and movement, rather than intervene in an engagement they had not initiated and could not safely reinforce from their current position. This was tactically sound. It was also, in Kowalski's assessment, exactly wrong. He moved to Hartley. He did not whisper. He spoke at the volume the situation required, which was louder than anything that had been said on the patrol in 5 days. "Sir, that platoon is in contact, heavy contact. They need fire support or reinforcement or both. We have a radio, we have a position. We can call a fire mission on the Viet Cong withdrawal routes right now, and we can move to provide a blocking position." Hartley's expression was that of a man hearing a suggestion that violates a rule he considers foundational. "We are a reconnaissance element. We do not have the strength to— We don't need the strength to win a firefight, sir. We need to call the fire mission and move to the blocking position. The rifle platoon pins them from the south. Artillery hits the withdrawal routes. We catch whoever breaks through." Kowalski already had the radio handset. He had the artillery frequency from the operation order. He had the grid coordinates from his map. "Give me 30 seconds. Hartley looked at him for 2 seconds that felt considerably longer. Then he said something that Kowalski would think about for years afterward. Not because it was wrong, because it was right in a way that was no longer sufficient for what was happening 800 meters to the south. "We'll compromise the patrol." "Sir, the patrol is already compromised. That firefight is going to bring every Viet Cong element in this area to this grid. We are 6 men in the middle of their response corridor." Sitting still and watching is no longer an option. Another 2 seconds. The firefight to the south had not diminished. It had intensified. Someone down there was having a very bad morning. "Make the call," Hartley said. Kowalski made the call. He gave the artillery the target grid, the withdrawal routes, the danger close distance from the friendly element to the south.
He talked the guns onto the target with the rapid, precise language of someone who had practiced this until it was reflex. The first rounds were in the air 40 seconds after he keyed the handset. They were not perfectly placed. The first adjustment took 20 seconds. The second adjustment took 15. By the time the rounds were walking correctly across the Viet Cong withdrawal routes, the firefight to the south had been going for 4 minutes. What the artillery did in the next 3 minutes was not elegant. It was not surgical. It was not the precise, carefully constructed, culminating blow that Hartley's methodology worked toward over weeks of patient intelligence development. It was 5 guns firing for effect on a withdrawal corridor, dropping high explosive on terrain features that Kowalski had assessed as the most likely routes based on the map and the sound of the firefight, and 4 months of studying how the D445 battalion responded to contact. His assessment was partially correct. The Viet Cong had 2 withdrawal routes prepared.
The artillery hit one of them accurately, and the other at the edge of the effective radius. The after-action assessment would later determine that the fire mission had disrupted a planned Viet Cong withdrawal in strength and had contributed to a break in contact that allowed the rifle platoon to extract its casualties. The patrol moved to a blocking position. They were in place when 3 Viet Cong fighters moving fast through the undergrowth ran into the 6 Australians and 1 American who were waiting for them. The contact lasted 11 seconds. 3 Viet Cong dead. No Australian or American casualties. Kowalski fired 8 rounds from his M16 and assessed that 4 of them had contributed to the outcome. In the silence after the contact, crouched in cover with empty cases on the ground around him, and his ears ringing from the noise that the careful patrol silence had made all the more startling by contrast, Kowalski looked at Hartley. Hartley was looking at the 3 dead Viet Cong with an expression that contained several things simultaneously. Professional assessment, the specific discomfort of a man whose framework has just been challenged by events, and something else, something that took Kowalski a moment to identify because he had not expected to see it on Hartley's face. Respect. Not for Kowalski specifically, for the situation, for what had just happened and what it implied about the limits of what he had believed. "The fire mission," Hartley said. His voice was quiet, not the practiced quiet of the patrol, the genuine quiet of a man thinking carefully. "You had those grids ready." "From the operation order, sir. Standard practice before any patrol. I work out the likely fire support requirements for the area of operations and pre-plan the missions." "We don't do that for SAS patrols. Fire support compromises the intelligence picture," Kowalski said. "Yes, sir. But the rifle platoon to the south didn't have an intelligence picture. They had an ambush." Hartley looked at him. "You're saying the methodology failed to account for the adjacent element." "I'm saying the methodology optimizes for the SAS patrol's intelligence mission and does not weight heavily enough the potential requirement to support other elements operating in the same area of operations." Kowalski paused. "Which is a different failure than the methodology being wrong about the jungle. The jungle methodology is good, sir. The integration with conventional forces is the gap." This was, he recognized as he said it, a more precise critique than anything he had articulated in the operations tent before the patrol. The patrol had given him the specificity that the map and the after-action reports had not. He could not have said it accurately before he had watched the D445 resupply column walk through the 30-meter ambush, and then watched the rifle platoon get hit from the south while the SAS patrol observed withdrawal routes. The pattern was visible now in a way it had not been from the operations tent. Hartley smoked a cigarette,
the first one Kowalski had seen him smoke in the field. He smoked it down to the filter without speaking. Then he said, "We extract tomorrow morning. I want to debrief this fully at Nui Dat." "Yes, sir." "Your fire mission call was correct. I want that documented." Kowalski looked at him. "Sir, the fire mission call was possible because the patrol had developed a position from which the withdrawal routes were observable. That's the SAS methodology, producing the conditions for effective fire support. It's not one or the other." Hartley studied him for a moment. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate, sir." The extraction happened at first light. The patrol moved out of the long high hills at the same deliberate pace it had entered, and Kowalski moved with it, and noticed that the pace felt different now. Not too slow, but appropriately calibrated to the terrain and the threat. And he tried to identify when his perception had shifted, and could not locate the exact moment. At Nui Dat, Hartley debriefed the patrol with the thorough, methodical precision that characterized everything the Australian SAS did. He documented the trail, the resupply column, the fire mission, the blocking position contact. He documented Kowalski's pre-planned fire support grids.
He documented his own decision to authorize the fire mission after 2 seconds of consideration, when his initial instinct had been to refuse it. That last item was in the official record because Hartley put it there. He did not have to. He could have written the debrief in a way that described the fire mission decision as a natural evolution of the tactical situation, rather than a reversal of his initial assessment. He chose not to. He wrote it accurately because he was, Kowalski had come to understand, a man who believed that the operational record should be honest, even when honesty was uncomfortable. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the thing that made the subsequent conversation possible. The conversation happened in Hartley's tent at Nui Dat that evening, after the formal debrief was complete and the other patrol members had dispersed to whatever soldiers did in the hours between operations. Hartley poured 2 mugs of tea from a battered pot that looked like it had survived several previous wars, and handed one to Kowalski without asking whether he wanted it. Kowalski drank the tea. It was strong and too hot, and he drank it anyway. "The rifle platoon," Hartley said. 5th Battalion. What was their casualty count?" 3 killed, 7 wounded. 2 of the wounded are serious. Kowalski had gotten the report from the operations center on the way back to Nui Dat. "The ambush was well prepared." D445, full company strength, coordinated fire from 3 sides. And without the fire mission, the extraction would have been significantly more difficult, possibly not possible under their own power. Hartley wrapped both hands around his mug. The SAS methodology does not account for this adequately. We plan for the patrol's intelligence mission. We plan for the patrol's security. We do not plan for the patrol's potential role as the only available fire support element for adjacent conventional forces in contact. No, sir. In a province where we're operating SAS patrols throughout the same area of operations as infantry battalions, that's a planning failure. Yes, sir. Hartley drank his tea. Your pre-planned fire missions, that's standard American practice for all patrols? For all patrols operating in areas where artillery is in range, yes. Before we step off, we work out the most likely threat scenarios, pre-plan the missions, confirm the frequencies and call signs with the artillery battery. Takes about 40 minutes in planning and 30 seconds to execute when you need it. We don't do this because the pre-planned missions have to be registered with the Task Force Fire Support Coordinator, which means people know where the SAS patrol is operating, which creates a security risk. Sir,
I registered the missions under a false grid reference and corrected it on the fly once we were in position.
Standard technique for maintaining operational security while keeping the fire support option available. Hartley looked at him. You registered false grids. I registered a grid that indicated the general area without specifying the patrol's actual position. The artillery battery knows there's a patrol in that sector. They don't know exactly where. When I made the call, I gave them real grids, because at that point the operational security concern was secondary to the immediate situation. There was a pause. Hartley's expression suggested he was processing the specific gap between his own methodology's approach to this problem and the approach that had just demonstrated its value in a 10-day field environment. That's not in any Australian SAS doctrine I've read. No, sir. It's something a sergeant at Fort Bragg taught me. He said, never go into the jungle without a way to make the jungle louder than you need it to be. Hartley almost smiled. It was the nearest thing to a smile Kowalski had seen from him in 10 days, plus 2 weeks of prior interaction. Never go into the jungle without a way to make it louder. Yes, sir. The D445 resupply column, 11 men at 30 meters. I made the call not to engage. I stand by that call in terms of intelligence value. But the intelligence we were protecting was the trail network and the base camp location. We subsequently lost access to both when the firefight to the south brought D445 elements into the area. Yes, sir. The intelligence picture you were protecting was disrupted by an event the methodology didn't account for. So the cost of not engaging was the kills we didn't take and the intelligence we lost when the area became active. The benefit was the intelligence we might have developed if the situation had remained stable. The situation stopped being stable the moment the 5th Battalion platoon made contact, which we couldn't have predicted. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. This was the genuinely difficult part of the analysis, not the fire mission call, which had been straightforward once he had made it. The difficult part was the resupply column, because Hartley had not been wrong about the intelligence value of letting it pass. He had been operating correctly within his methodology's framework. The framework's failure was not visible from inside the framework until something outside it happened. Sir, I don't think the call on the column was wrong, given what you knew at the time. The methodology assumes a stable intelligence environment. The methodology is very good at exploiting a stable intelligence environment. The gap is in the transitions, when the environment stops being stable faster than the methodology can adapt. Hartley set down his mug. He looked at Kowalski with the specific attention of a man who is about to say something he has not said to a junior officer before, and is deciding whether the junior officer has earned it. You came on this patrol expecting to prove the Australian methodology wrong. Sir, I came on this patrol expecting to understand it. I understood it. It's not wrong. It's incomplete in a specific way that the combination with American fire support doctrine can address. And you arrived at that conclusion in 10 days. I arrived at the beginning of it in 10 days. The full conclusion would take longer. Kowalski paused. I'd want to run the patrol again, twice more, maybe 3 times. Different terrain, different threat scenario. See whether the gap I identified is consistent or whether it was specific to this operation. Hartley looked at him for a long moment. You want to keep running patrols with the SAS. I want to understand the methodology well enough to make a useful contribution to improving it. That requires more time in the field. Most American officers who come to Nui Dot want to observe the methodology and then go back to their units and implement it unchanged. You're suggesting something different. I'm suggesting that the methodology is good enough to be worth improving. That's a different relationship with it than either adopting it whole or rejecting it. Hartley picked up his mug again. He drank the last of the tea and set it down and looked at the canvas wall of the tent with the expression of a man deciding something. I'm going to propose a joint patrol program to the task force commander. 6 months. American fire support specialists embedded with SAS patrols. We develop pre-planned fire support protocols that maintain SAS operational security standards. We test them against the D445 in Phuc Tuy province. Kowalski said nothing. He was waiting. I'll need a written proposal from the American side supporting the operational rationale. Something that doesn't make this look like I'm admitting the SAS methodology has a gap that an American captain identified in 10 days. I can write something that frames it as a natural evolution of combined arms doctrine in a jungle environment, Kowalski said, which is accurate. That's what I'd wanted to say. Hartley stood. Get some sleep. I want the proposal draft in 48 hours. Kowalski stood and moved to the tent opening. Then he stopped. Sir, the call to authorize the fire mission. The 2 seconds. Hartley looked at him. That was the right call. But I know it wasn't easy. I know it felt like it was contradicting everything the methodology requires. I want you to know that I understand that. Hartley was quiet for a moment. It contradicted the methodology in the moment. In retrospect, it was consistent with the methodology's objective, which is to produce conditions for the enemy's decisive defeat. The fire mission contributed to that objective. The methodology failed to anticipate the path. He paused. That's the kind of failure worth examining. Yes, sir. 48 hours, Captain. Kowalski wrote the proposal in 36 hours. It was 12 pages. It addressed the operational rationale for embedding American fire support specialists with SAS long-range reconnaissance patrols, the pre-planned mission protocols that would maintain SAS operational security requirements, and the specific tactical scenarios where the combined capability produced outcomes that neither element could produce independently. He wrote one additional page that he did not include in the formal proposal. It was a description of the moment on day 3 of the patrol when 11 Viet Cong fighters had walked through a 30-meter ambush, and the patrol had watched them go, and the intelligence rationale for watching them go had been sound and had subsequently become irrelevant because of something nobody had predicted. He wrote it because he wanted to remember precisely what it felt like to watch 11 armed enemy fighters walk away, and understand both why that was the right call and why the framework that made it the right call was going to need adjustment. He kept the page in his personal notebook. It stayed there through the rest of his Vietnam tour and the subsequent assignments and the retirement ceremony at Fort Bragg in 1989 and the move to Virginia, where he spent 8 years teaching at the Army War College before his final retirement at 62. The proposal was approved by the task force commander within 2 weeks. The Joint Patrol program ran for 4 months before the Australian rotation ended, and the personnel changed, and the institutional continuity required to sustain it, frayed in the way that institutional continuity frays, when the people who built something rotate out, and the people who replace them inherit the structure without the understanding that built it. But 4 months produced enough operational data to support a formal after-action review that documented the combined methodology and its outcomes. The review was classified and distributed within the combined Allied command structure, and read by a modest number of people who were in positions to implement its recommendations, and a larger number of people who were not. Its central finding was that Australian SAS long-range reconnaissance methodology and American fire support planning doctrine were complementary capabilities, whose integration produced outcomes that neither produced independently, and that the gap between them, identified most clearly in situations where the stable intelligence environment the SAS methodology required was disrupted by adjacent conventional force contacts, could be addressed through pre-planned fire support protocols that maintained SAS operational security standards. The finding was accurate. It was also, as Hartley had predicted, framed in a way that did not describe it as a gap that an American captain had identified in 10 days. That was fine. The institutional document served the institutional purpose. The operational memory served a different one. Kowalski returned to Nui Dat 6 weeks after the Joint Patrol Program was approved. He came back not as an observer, but as the American liaison officer for the Combined Fire Support Integration Initiative, which was the official title that the task force had given to something that was, in operational practice, considerably simpler than its title suggested. He was there to run patrols with the SAS and help them call artillery when the situation required it. Hartley met him at the airstrip. The Caribou that had brought Kowalski in from Saigon was already taxiing back to the runway, its twin engines raising a red dust cloud that drifted across the perimeter wire and settled on everything within 50 meters. Hartley was wearing his slouch hat and smoking, and looked exactly as he had looked the first time Kowalski had seen him, deliberate and contained, and faintly skeptical of whatever was about to happen. "Captain," he said. "Major," Kowalski said. They shook hands. It was the handshake of two people who had been through something together and had not yet determined what that something meant for the relationship that came after. "The second patrol goes out in 4 days," Hartley said, walking toward the compound. "I want you to review the target package this afternoon and give me your fire support assessment before tonight's briefing." "Yes, sir." Kowalski fell into step beside him. "Same area of operations?" "Northern Fukti. Different terrain. Rubber plantation country rather than the long high hills. The D-445 has been using the plantations as a staging area for operations against Route 15. Hartley dropped his cigarette and ground it under his boot with the precise economy he applied to everything. "The plantation terrain changes the fire support calculus significantly." "How so?" "The canopy is different. Rubber trees are planted in rows, uniform spacing, good sight lines within the rows, but dense overhead cover. Artillery airbursts are effective. Delay fuse rounds into the root systems are effective. Direct fire through the rows at close range is extremely effective. Point detonating on the deck is largely wasted." Kowalski looked at him. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about it since your proposal was approved." Hartley was quiet for 3 steps. "I spent 20 years developing a methodology that I believed was complete. 10 days with you suggested it was not complete in a specific and correctable way. I find that I would like to correct it as thoroughly as possible." This was, Kowalski understood, a significant statement from a man who communicated in the precise and minimal way that Hartley communicated. It was not an admission of failure. It was something more interesting than that. It was the statement of a professional who had identified an improvement and was committed to implementing it with the same rigor he had applied to everything else. The target package for the second patrol was on a folding table in the intelligence section when Kowalski arrived to review it. It was thorough in the way Australian SAS target packages were thorough. Human pattern analysis, trail mapping, estimated enemy strength and disposition, patrol routes with primary and alternate options. Everything the methodology was designed to produce. What it did not contain, and what Kowalski spent the afternoon developing, was a fire support annex. He worked through the terrain systematically, identified the likely Viet Cong positions based on the intelligence picture the previous patrols had developed, pre-planned 12 fire missions covering the primary withdrawal routes and the 3 most probable ambush positions. He confirmed frequencies and call signs with the artillery battery at Nui Dat and registered false grids in the task force fire support log
using the protocol he had described to Hartley in the tent 6 weeks earlier. By evening briefing, he had a 4-page annex that he presented after the main patrol brief. The SAS operators listened to it with the attention that professionals give to information that is relevant to their survival, which is to say, completely and without expression.
One of them, a corporal named Treadway, who had been on the first patrol and had the specific quality of very experienced junior soldiers who have seen enough to be selectively impressed, raised his hand at the end. "Captain, the pre-planned missions. If we call one of those, the battery has a fix on our approximate location within a few hundred meters." "Yes?" "That's a security compromise." "It's a security trade-off. The battery knows a patrol is operating in that general area. They don't know our exact position. When we call a mission, we give real grids because at the point we're calling fire support, the security concern is secondary to the contact situation. The trade-off is acceptable because the alternative is going into the field without the capability to call fire support, which the last patrol demonstrated is a gap." Treadway absorbed this. "What if the battery's frequency is compromised? The Viet Cong monitor our radio traffic." "We use the one-time pad encryption for all fire mission calls. The grids are encoded. Even if the frequency is being monitored, the enemy can't derive our position from an encoded transmission in real time." "Can't or probably can't?" Kowalski looked at him. It was a good question. The kind of question that junior soldiers asked when they were genuinely thinking about their survival, rather than performing engagement with the briefing. "Probably can't. Nothing in this environment is absolute. The trade-off is calculated, not guaranteed." Treadway nodded once and said nothing further. Kowalski noted that he had not expressed satisfaction with the answer, only accepted it as honest, which was a different thing, and in some ways more valuable. Hartley closed the briefing. The patrol would insert at 0400 on Thursday. 4 days of preparation. Those 4 days were different from the preparation period before the first patrol. The first time, Kowalski had been an observer, allowed to carry his own weapon and take notes. This time, he was part of the planning process, contributing to the patrol route selection, working through the fire support annex with Hartley and the patrol commander, a lieutenant named Sayers, who had 6 months in country, and the controlled intensity of someone who had converted anxiety into focus through sustained operational experience. Sayers was younger than Kowalski, and had been doing this longer than Kowalski, and treated the fire support integration with the specific seriousness of a man who understood that the last patrol had produced an outcome that would have been different without it. He asked good questions. He pushed back on 2 of the pre-planned mission grids because the terrain analysis suggested the Viet Cong would use different routes than Kowalski had assessed. And he was right about one of them, and partially right about the other, and the annex was adjusted accordingly. The insertion happened on schedule. 0400, single file, into rubber plantation country that was different from the long high hills in ways Hartley had described, and several he had not. The rows of rubber trees created a geometry that was disorienting in darkness, uniform and regular in a way that the chaotic jungle growth of the hills was not. Navigation was easier because the rows provided consistent reference points, and harder because every direction looked like every other direction, until you had a firm fix on your compass bearing and your position relative to a known feature. The pace was the same. 3 steps, pause, listen. Kowalski had expected this to be easier the second time, having experienced it once. It was not easier. His feet remembered the deliberate stepping, and his legs remembered the effort, and his ears were marginally better at the listening part, capable of distinguishing more categories of sound from the ambient background than they had been in October. But the fundamental discipline of moving at a pace that felt operationally irresponsible was not something that became natural through a single experience.
It became manageable. Natural was further away than that. On the second day, they located the primary staging area that the intelligence picture had suggested. Not a fixed base camp, but a dispersed series of positions using the rubber trees as overhead cover, well concealed from aerial observation, well positioned for movement along the plantation roads toward Route 15.
Sayers documented it with the thoroughness of the SAS methodology. Photographs, sketches, grid coordinates, estimated personnel strength based on sign. The picture he built in 2 hours of careful observation was more detailed and more accurate than anything aerial reconnaissance had produced on the same position. Kowalski watched him work and thought about the fire support annex in his pocket, and the pre-planned missions he had registered, and the 3 positions in the plantation that he had assessed as Viet Cong ambush locations, and which were now confirmed by the observations Sayers was conducting. The methodology was producing exactly what it was designed to produce: precise, actionable intelligence developed through patient observation. And this time, the intelligence environment was stable. No adjacent conventional force contact to the south, no unexpected disruption. The patrol was doing what the patrol was supposed to do in the conditions the patrol was supposed to do it in. On the third day, they found the command element. Not accidentally, not through the specific misfortune of the 6-day patrol where they had walked into Viet Cong sentries. Deliberately, through the progressive reading of the intelligence picture Sayers had been building since insertion. The command element was in a position that made sense given the trail network, the staging area location, the pattern of activity the patrol had observed. Sayers had identified it as the most probable command post location on the morning of the second day, and had spent the remainder of that day moving toward it with the patience that the methodology required. They were in a position overlooking it by 0900 on day 3, a reinforced bunker position with communications wire running east toward a second position they could not see. 3 personnel visible. One of them was giving orders to the other 2 in the specific manner of someone who had authority and was exercising it. Command element. Battalion level or higher based on the communications infrastructure. Sayers looked at Kowalski, not for permission, for assessment. Kowalski looked at the position. He looked at his map. He looked at the pre-planned fire missions and identified the one that was closest to this position. Pre-planned Mission 7 covered the eastern tree line of grid square Victor Tango 44. The command post was in grid square Victor Tango 44. The pre-planned mission was registered for a point 300 meters north of the command post's actual location. He could adjust from the pre-planned. The adjustment would take 40 seconds. The battery was on the frequency. The one-time pad was in his breast pocket. He looked at Sayers and shook his head once. Sayers nodded once. The patrol held. They held for 2 hours. The command element activity continued. A runner arrived from the east and departed to the south. Another runner arrived from the south and departed to the north. The communications wire pulsed with activity that they could observe but not decode. At 1100, Sayers signaled the patrol to withdraw. They had what they had come for: the command post location, the communications pattern, the runner routes that mapped the battalion's internal coordination structure. Enough to bring the rifle companies in with a target package so complete that the subsequent operation would know exactly where to go and exactly what it would find when it got there. The withdrawal took the rest of the day. Sayers moved the patrol south through terrain that had been fully mapped during the insertion, using the rubber tree rows as navigation references, maintaining the same deliberate pace in withdrawal that he had maintained throughout. By last light, they were in a holding position 2 kilometers south of the command post, in cover, watching and listening.
At 0200, something changed. Kowalski heard it before he understood it. A shift in the quality of the darkness. Not a sound, exactly. A pressure. The feeling of the air being displaced by something large and organized moving through it. He had felt this once before in the long high hills on the morning of day 6, 30 seconds before the sentries had appeared. He put his hand on Sayers's arm. Sayers was already awake. He had felt it too. The Viet Cong element moving through the rubber plantation to the east was large.
The sound resolved gradually from pressure into footsteps. Multiple footsteps. The specific quality of organized movement rather than random passage. A company, possibly more, moving south along the plantation road parallel to the patrol's position, moving in the direction of Route 15. Sayers looked at Kowalski. This was not the pre-planned scenario. This was the scenario from the first patrol. The resupply column walked through the ambush, transposed into a larger and more dangerous form. A company-strength Viet Cong element moving toward Route 15 in the middle of the night with presumably hostile intentions toward whatever was on Route 15. Kowalski did not wait for Sayers's signal. He had the radio handset. He had the frequencies. He had the pre-planned missions and the adjustment he had worked out in his head during the 2 hours at the command post observation position. He keyed the handset and spoke at the volume that encoded transmissions required, which was low, but not a whisper. The voice of a man doing something procedural and urgent simultaneously. He gave the battery the pre-planned mission number. He gave the adjustment from the registered grid to the road the Viet Cong element was moving along. He gave the fuse command, airburst, because the rubber trees provided no meaningful overhead protection along the road itself, and airburst rounds would be maximally effective against personnel in the open. He gave the fire command. 2 guns, 3 rounds, adjust. The battery acknowledged. 18 seconds later, the first rounds arrived. They were 200 meters long, hitting in the rubber trees north of the road rather than on the road itself. Kowalski adjusted south 200, added left 50, gave the fire for effect command. The battery acknowledged. The next 6 rounds hit the road. The Viet Cong element reacted the way trained soldiers react to accurate artillery, which is to say, immediately and in multiple directions simultaneously. Some went north, back toward the plantation interior. Some went south, trying to push through the beaten zone and out the other side. Some went east and west, off the road and into the rubber trees. Kowalski was already adjusting. He walked the rounds north to catch the element moving back toward the plantation interior. He held on the road to catch the element pushing south. He could not effectively engage the lateral movement without risking rounds close enough to the patrol's position to create a danger-close situation. Sayers made a decision that Kowalski had not anticipated, and that demonstrated something about the SAS methodology that Kowalski had not fully appreciated from the operations tent or even from the first patrol. Sayers moved the patrol, not away from the contact, toward the eastern edge of the beaten zone, to a position where the Viet Cong moving laterally off the road into the rubber trees would emerge. He moved the patrol in 60 seconds, silently, to a position that was 30 meters from where the artillery was impacting, which was genuinely close, and which required a level of confidence in the fire support plan and the fire support caller that Sayers had not had 6 weeks ago, and demonstrably had now. The Viet Cong element moving east off the road ran into the patrol. The contact lasted 45 seconds. It was loud and close and completely unlike the deliberate, controlled engagements that the SAS methodology was designed to produce. It was a meeting engagement in rubber plantation darkness at ranges measured in meters rather than the 30-meter precision of an established ambush.
6 Australians and 1 American firing at muzzle flashes and movement in the specific controlled chaos of a contact that had not been planned and was being won through aggression and noise and the willingness to be louder than the situation felt comfortable with. 12 Viet Cong dead, 3 wounded, subsequently captured, 1 Australian wounded, a flesh wound to the forearm that would require stitches and produce a scar, but would not prevent him from returning to duty. No fatalities. The artillery continued working the road for another 4 minutes after the patrol contact ended, catching the element that had pushed south trying to extract from the beaten zone.
The after-action assessment would credit the combined action with disrupting a company-strength Viet Cong movement to contact against a South Vietnamese militia post on Route 15 that had no idea it was about to be attacked. In the rubber plantation in the darkness after the contact, in the specific silence that follows a firefight, when the ears are ringing and the hands are still and the mind is processing what just happened and what it means, Sayers looked at Kowalski. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "The adjustment, 200 south, 50 left. How long did that take you?" 18 seconds. Sayers was quiet again. Around them, the patrol was doing what patrol members do after a contact, checking each other, checking the wounded, checking the perimeter, the quiet, efficient activity of people who have trained for this and are executing it. The rubber trees were full of the smell of cordite and something organic that Kowalski did not examine. 18 seconds, Sayers said. The pre-planned mission was close. The adjustment was straightforward. I'd worked the geometry at the command post position this afternoon. You worked the fire support geometry while we were observing the command post. While you were documenting the command post, I was doing what I was there to do. Sayers considered this.
He was 24 years old, which Kowalski had learned during the planning phase, and had the quality that very good young officers sometimes have of being older than their age in the specific dimension that mattered, and exactly their age in every other dimension. He was old enough to recognize what had just happened, and young enough to say what he thought about it without the diplomatic processing that older officers applied to observations that complicated their existing framework. "The methodology produced the command post location," Sayers said. "Your fire support produced the road interdiction. Neither one of us could have done both." "No. But you couldn't have done your part without the intelligence picture we built getting you to that position." "Correct. And we couldn't have done what we just did without your 18 seconds." "Also correct." Sayers looked at the rubber trees for a moment. Then he looked at Kowalski. "How do we write this up so that the people who read the after-action report understand what actually happened, rather than just the outcome?" It was, Kowalski thought, the right question, the exact right question, asked by exactly the right person at exactly the right moment, which was the specific and unreproducible quality of being in the field with someone who was genuinely thinking rather than performing competence. "We write it in 2 parts, Kowalski said.
What the SAS methodology produced and why it was the necessary foundation for the outcome. What the fire support integration produced and why it was the necessary operational application of that foundation. Then we write the part that's hardest to write, the part where Sayers moved the patrol 30 meters from an active artillery-beaten zone because he trusted the fire support plan enough to do it." Sayers looked at him. "Why is that the hardest part to write?" "Because it requires the report to acknowledge that the decision was based on trust rather than process. And institutional reports are uncomfortable with trust as a primary decision factor, because trust is not systematizable." Sayers was quiet for a moment.
The patrol had completed its post-contact checks and was settling into a defensive perimeter with the automatic efficiency of people who had done this enough times that the individual steps had merged into a single, continuous action. Treadway was on the eastern perimeter, watching the direction the Viet Cong element had come from. The wounded Australian, a private named Hewitt, whose forearm had been creased by a round that had come close enough to matter and far enough to allow him to be here and ambulatory, was having the wound dressed by the patrol medic with the focused calm of someone who had decided that being wounded was a problem to be solved rather than an event to be experienced. "Trust as a primary decision factor," Sayers said.
He was turning the phrase over the way people turn unfamiliar objects over, examining it from multiple angles. The movement to the eastern edge of the beaten zone. You're saying I did that because I trusted your fire support plan. You did it because you had watched me work for 2 days and had formed an assessment of my competence that told you the plan was sound enough to put the patrol 30 meters from the impact point. That assessment was based on observation and relationship, not process. The pre-patrol briefing was process. The briefing established the plan. The trust established whether you would use it the way you used it tonight. A different caller, same plan, you might have moved the patrol 50 meters further east. The margin matters. Sayers absorbed this. Around them, the jungle, or rather the plantation, which had its own specific quality of darkness and smell and sound, distinct from the jungle proper, continued its nighttime operation. Insects and distant artillery and the specific silence of a large area recently disturbed by violence returning to its ambient state. The after-action report, Sayers said. If we write the trust section accurately, what happens to it? It gets read by people who were not here and who will translate it into something they can use institutionally. Which means the trust section becomes a recommendation for relationship-building protocols and cross-training requirements and joint pre-patrol procedures. All of which are valuable, none of which reproduce what you did at 0230 in a rubber plantation. Because what I did can't be reproduced by a protocol. It can be made more likely by the conditions that produced it. You can create conditions where trust is more probable. You cannot mandate the trust itself. Sayers looked at him. The darkness was beginning to thin in the east, the specific pre-dawn lightning that was not yet light, but was the absence of the deepest darkness. The moment when the sky remembered it was capable of a different color. You sound like you've thought about this for longer than this patrol. I've been thinking about it since the first patrol, Kowalski said. Since you let 11 Viet Cong fighters walk through the 30-meter ambush. Sayers had not been on the first patrol. He had read the debrief. He knew the outline of what had happened. But the outline was not the thing, and Kowalski had not been sure until this moment whether Sayers had understood the distinction. Major Hartley's call, Sayers said. His call. My question. The same question I'm still working through. Kowalski shifted his position against the rubber tree he was using as a backrest, a movement so carefully controlled it produced no sound. The question is not whether the SAS methodology is right or wrong. It's right. It's one of the most effective reconnaissance methodologies I've encountered in the jungle environment. The question is what the methodology assumes about the operational environment and whether those assumptions hold consistently enough to build an entire approach on them. The stable intelligence environment assumption. Yes, the methodology assumes you have time. Time to watch, to build the picture, to choose your moment. In Phuoc Tuy province, in this period, that assumption holds roughly 70% of the time. In the other 30%, something happens that compresses the timeline faster than the methodology can adapt. Sayers thought about this, The 30% is what fire support integration addresses. Partially, fire support integration addresses the cases where the timeline compression is sudden and the enemy is exposed to indirect fire. It doesn't address the cases where the timeline compression is gradual, where the intelligence environment degrades slowly rather than collapsing suddenly. That's a different problem. What addresses that? Kowalski was quiet for a moment. The eastern sky had continued its progress towards something that could be called light, and the rubber trees were beginning to acquire individual identity from the massive darkness they had been during the contact. Row after row of straight trunks at uniform spacing. The plantation geometry that had disoriented him during insertion, and that now felt almost familiar. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's what the next 4 months are for." The extraction happened at first light. A helicopter came in to the pre-planned landing zone a kilometer south of the contact area, and the patrol, loaded with the practiced speed of people who understood that the time between touching down and lifting off was the most dangerous period of any patrol, and that shortening it was a matter of survival rather than preference. The helicopter was in and out in under 40 seconds. Hewitt's arm was assessed by the flight medic as requiring 12 stitches and no further immediate intervention. At Nui Dat, Hartley was waiting at the landing zone. He had been tracking the patrol's radio traffic from the operations center and had heard the fire mission calls and the contact report, and had spent the remaining hours of the night doing what experienced senior officers do when a subordinate element is in contact, and there is nothing useful the senior officer can do except remain available and follow the tactical situation closely enough to support if support becomes possible. He looked at Hewitt's arm. He looked at the patrol. He looked at Kowalski. Then he said, "Debrief in 1 hour. Get something to eat first." The debrief lasted 3 hours. It was thorough in the way Hartley's debriefs were always thorough, systematic, focused, with the specific quality of an investigation conducted by someone who wanted to understand what had happened and why, rather than to produce a particular narrative about it. He asked each patrol member to describe what they had observed and done in sequence. He asked Kowalski to walk through the fire mission calls in detail, including the timing, the adjustments, and the decision process. When Kowalski described Sayers's movement of the patrol to the eastern edge of the beaten zone, Hartley stopped him. 30 meters from the impact point." "Yes, sir." "The pre-planned mission's registered position was 300 meters north of your actual position at the time of the call." "Yes, sir. I adjusted 200 south, 50 left, which put the impact point on the road. The patrol was 30 meters west of the impact point during the adjustment phase and moved east to the current position after the rounds were confirmed on target." Hartley looked at Sayers. "Lieutenant, the decision to move toward the beaten zone." "Yes, sir." "Walk me through it." Sayers described it with the same economical precision he applied to everything. The Viet Cong element moving east off the road, the likely emergence point, the decision to position the patrol to intercept rather than allow the element to pass and disperse into the plantation where pursuit would be impossible, and the intelligence picture would be complicated by their knowledge that a patrol was in the area. "And the proximity to the artillery impact," Hartley said. Captain Kowalski's adjustment had put the rounds on the road accurately. The adjustment to the lateral movement would have required either walking the rounds across the patrol's position, which was not acceptable, or accepting that the element moving east would escape the fire. Moving the patrol to the eastern intercept position resolved both problems. By placing the patrol 30 meters from active artillery. By placing the patrol at the edge of the fragmentation radius of airburst rounds in rubber plantation terrain, yes, sir. The fragmentation pattern was predictable, given the fuse setting and the tree geometry. The risk was assessed as acceptable, given the alternative. Hartley looked at him for a moment. You assessed the fragmentation pattern of artillery rounds in rubber plantation terrain at 0230 in the middle of a contact? I assessed it based on the briefing Captain Kowalski gave before insertion, which included the effective radius of airburst rounds in plantation terrain. Sayers paused. And based on the 2 days of working with Captain Kowalski that told me his fire support plan was sound enough to rely on. The debrief room was quiet. Hartley looked at Kowalski. Kowalski said nothing. He had said what he needed to say the previous night in the plantation, and there was nothing useful to add to it here. Hartley made a note. He made several more notes. Then he looked up. The contact result. 12 confirmed kills, 3 prisoners, Route 15 militia post not attacked.
The intelligence product from the command post observation, battalion command element location, communications pattern, runner routes, is still valid and will be actioned through the rifle companies next week. He paused. This is the outcome the combined methodology is supposed to produce. Yes, sir, Kowalski said. The outcome required the SAS reconnaissance phase to identify the command post and the movement pattern. It required the fire support integration to interdict the movement, and it required Lieutenant Sayers to make a decision at 0230 that was based on a relationship developed over 2 days and a briefing conducted 48 hours earlier. Yes, sir. Hartley set down his pen. He looked at the table for a moment, then at Kowalski, then at Sayers, then at the table again. It was the look of a man who is arranging something in his mind and finding that the arrangement requires more space than he had allocated for it. The relationship component, he said. The trust that produced the movement to the eastern position. How do we develop that systematically across the program? We don't develop it systematically, Kowalski said. We develop the conditions that make it more likely. Consistent pairing of specific American fire support specialists with specific SAS patrol elements. Enough pre-patrol time together that both elements understand each other's decision process before they're in the field. Joint planning sessions that go deeper than the patrol brief. Shared meals, shared time. The things that produce relationship rather than coordination. Hartley absorbed this. The Australian Army does not formally structure relationships as an operational output. No army does, sir. That's why they have to happen informally, and why the institutional documentation will describe this as cross-training and liaison and pre-patrol coordination, rather than what it actually is. What it actually is, Hartley said, not as a question. 2 people who have spent enough time together to know how the other thinks, which is not a training output. It's a human outcome that training can create conditions for, but cannot mandate or systematize. Hartley picked up his pen again. He looked at it for a moment. Then he wrote something that Kowalski could not read from across the table, which was probably intentional. The program continues, he said. Same structure, consistent pairing, Captain Kowalski with 2nd Patrol Element for the duration of the program period. He looked at Sayers. You're comfortable with that? It was not a question, but Sayers answered it anyway. Yes, sir. Good. Hartley stood. 48 hours rest, then planning begins for the 3rd patrol. He moved toward the tent opening and stopped. He turned back to Kowalski. The pre-planned mission number 7, the one that was close to the command post position. Yes, sir. You worked the adjustment geometry at the command post observation position. Yes, sir. While Sayers was documenting the command post. Yes, sir. Hartley was quiet for a moment. That was good work, Captain. From Hartley, in the specific economy of his communication, this was the equivalent of a lengthy, formal commendation. Kowalski understood it as such and received it accordingly. "Thank you, sir." Hartley left. Sayers and Kowalski sat in the debrief room in the specific silence of people who have just been through something and have not yet transitioned out of it. Outside, Nui Dat was doing its morning things. The sounds of a military base in the operational pause between one thing and the next. Somewhere across the perimeter, a generator was running. Somewhere further, artillery was firing a registration mission, the single rounds and pauses of a gun crew checking their data. 48 hours, Sayers said. Yes. What do you do with 48 hours at Nui Dat? Kowalski thought about this. He had been at Nui Dat for a total of 3 weeks across 2 visits and had spent most of that time in planning or patrolling or sleeping the specific sleep of someone who has been operating on patrol rest cycles and needs to recover. Sleep for 12 hours, he said. Write up my personal operational notes for the last patrol. Review the intelligence on the 3rd patrol area. Sayers nodded.
The personal operational notes. What goes in those? Things that don't go in the official report. The things that happened and why they mattered in ways the official report doesn't have language for. Like the trust section. Like the trust section. Like the specific geometry of the adjustment I worked at the command post position and why I worked it then rather than at the pre-patrol brief. Like the moment you decided to move the patrol and what I observed in your decision process from my position in the patrol order. Kowalski paused. The official report will say the patrol achieved its objectives through the combined application of SAS reconnaissance methodology and American fire support integration. The personal notes will say how. Sayers was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Kowalski had not expected. Can I read them? The personal notes? Kowalski looked at him. It was an unusual request. Not inappropriate, but unusual. Personal operational notes were personal in the specific sense that they contained the unfiltered version of the operational experience, the things that an officer thought and observed and concluded that were not suitable for formal documentation because they were too subjective or too critical or too dependent on context that the formal documentation could not carry. Why? Kowalski asked. Because you described what you observed in my decision process at the eastern position. I'd like to know what you saw. Sayers paused. I know what I decided. I don't know what it looked like from where you were standing. Kowalski considered this for a moment. It was, he thought, the kind of request that came from a specific kind of intelligence, the kind that understood that one's own perspective on a decision was not the complete account of the decision, and that other perspectives contained information that was operationally valuable rather than merely interesting. Yes, he said, after I've written them. He wrote them that afternoon, in the 48-hour rest period, in a tent that was hot enough in the Phuc Tuy midday to make thinking feel like physical labor. He wrote 8 pages, 3 pages on the fire support integration, the technical aspects, what had worked and what had required adjustment, and what he would change in the pre-planned mission structure for the 3rd patrol. 2 pages on the command post observation and the geometry work he had done while Sayers documented the position, and 3 pages on the contact, the movement to the eastern position, what he had observed in Sayers in the moment of that decision, and what it told him about the conditions under which the combined methodology produced outcomes that exceeded what either element could produce alone. The 3 pages on Sayers were the hardest to write, not because the observation was unclear, but because the language required to describe what he had seen was not the language that military documentation used. It was closer to the language of people who studied how decisions were made under pressure, which was a field of study that existed in 1967, but had not yet developed the specific vocabulary that would make this kind of description straightforward. He wrote it in the language he had, which was the language of a 26-year-old infantry captain who had been paying close attention for 10 days and 2 patrols, and who understood that what he had observed in the rubber plantation at 0230 was important and could not be allowed to exist only in his memory. He gave the notes to Sayers that evening. Sayers read them the same night and returned them the next morning without comment, which was not silence, but was the specific response of someone who had found what they were looking for and did not have anything to add to it. The 3rd patrol went out 8 days later. The area of operations was further north in the terrain between Nui Dat and the Long Khan provincial boundary, where the D445 had been establishing new logistics routes in response to the disruption the combined operations had produced in their previous network.
The intelligence picture suggested that the battalion was adapting, which Kowalski noted in his pre-patrol assessment as consistent with the pattern he had observed across the program. The combined methodology produced disruption that forced adaptation, and the adaptation created new intelligence requirements that the patient SAS methodology was well positioned to address. The cycle was becoming visible. Not a single operation or a single outcome, but a pattern across operations. The way that consistent pressure in one form generated predictable responses that created opportunities for pressure in a different form. Hartley had been trying to describe this to Kowalski in the operations tent before the 1st patrol, without the specific vocabulary for it, and Kowalski had been too focused on the rate of attrition problem to hear what Hartley was actually saying. He heard it now. The patient methodology was not trying to win individual engagements. It was trying to understand the enemy's operational logic well enough to make every engagement a trap rather than a contest. The fire support integration did not change that objective. It provided a tool that the methodology could use at the moments when the enemy's adaptation created exposure. This was, Kowalski understood on the morning of the 3rd insertion, a more sophisticated theory of warfare than the one he had brought to Nui Dat 4 months earlier.
He had brought a theory that measured success in kills and territory and operational tempo. The SAS methodology was measuring success in the enemy's decision space, in the progressive narrowing of the options available to the D445 as its logistics network was mapped and disrupted, and its command elements were located and eliminated. The kill ratio was an output of that progressive narrowing. It was not the objective. Hartley had been right about this. He had been right about it in a way that Kowalski's operations tent question about confirmed kills had not been designed to hear, because the question assumed that kills were the measure of effectiveness, rather than a symptom of it. He had needed 2 patrols and 1 night in a rubber plantation to understand the distinction. The 3rd patrol found the new logistics network in 4 days. The route was more sophisticated than the previous ones, using a combination of natural water features and cultivated land boundaries that were invisible from aerial observation, and that the SAS methodology was ideally suited to trace. Sayers built the picture methodically, moving along the route from south to north, photographing and sketching, building a target package that would allow the rifle companies to operate with the precision that the intelligence product enabled. On the 5th day, they located the primary waypoint, a structure built into the bank of a seasonal stream that was dry in this period, and that provided both concealment and access to the route network. 3 personnel present, possibly more in the structure itself. Communications equipment visible. Kowalski looked at his pre-planned missions. He had worked the fire support geometry for this area before insertion and had pre-planned missions that covered the waypoint structure from 3 different approach angles. The optimal mission used an adjusted delay fuse to penetrate the earth bank construction before detonation, which would destroy the structure and its contents comprehensively, rather than merely suppressing the personnel. Sayers looked at him, the same look as the rubber plantation, asking for assessment. Kowalski held up his hand flat, palm down. Wait. They waited. 40 minutes. 2 additional personnel arrived at the waypoint from the north, carrying loads. They entered the structure. A 6th person emerged from the structure and moved south along the streambed. Kowalski watched the 6th person. The movement pattern was different from the resupply personnel, more deliberate, stopping at intervals, checking back. He wrote 2 words in his notebook and showed them to Sayers. Sayers read them, nodded once. The 2 words were command element.
The 6th person was a senior figure, doing what senior figures did when they visited logistics waypoints, inspecting, checking, ensuring that the network was functioning. The waypoint itself was valuable intelligence. The 6th person was potentially more valuable than the waypoint. They watched for another 30 minutes. The 6th person completed the inspection and moved north, back the way they had come. Sayers signaled the patrol to follow at a distance that maintained visual contact, without compromising the observation. They followed for 2 hours. The terrain changed from the streambed to secondary growth jungle, thicker, slower, requiring the full discipline of the SAS pace. Kowalski moved through it with the automatic stepping that was beginning, after 2 patrols, to feel less like an imposed discipline and more like a response to the environment, the jungle communicating the correct speed and the body learning to hear it. The 6th person led them to a position that confirmed the intelligence assessment. A command post, more substantial than the one they had observed in the plantation, with multiple structures and what appeared to be a signals element based on the antenna configuration visible through the canopy. Sayers documented it for 90 minutes. Kowalski worked fire support geometry for the entire 90 minutes, identifying the optimal mission configurations for 3 different scenarios, locating the fall of shot in relation to the patrol's position, calculating the adjustment sequences that would walk the rounds onto each structure in the sequence that would be most effective if the situation required a fire mission rather than a withdrawal. He hoped it would not require a fire mission. The intelligence product from a documented command post, extracted intact and used to plan a rifle company operation, was worth more than the outcome of a fire mission that would destroy the position and alert the network. He was thinking like Hartley now, weighing the immediate option against the delayed option and calculating which produced the greater cumulative effect. The answer was the delayed option. Extract, report, action through the rifle companies. They extracted on the 7th day, clean, without contact, without compromise. The target package Sayers had built was the most complete intelligence product the program had generated. A command post location with communications infrastructure, access routes, personnel patterns, and the logistics waypoint that fed it all, documented in enough detail to support a battalion-level operation. The rifle company operation happened 11 days later. It was outside Kowalski's direct involvement. He was in planning for the 4th patrol when it executed, but he read the after-action report when it was filed. The operation had gone where the intelligence said to go, and found what the intelligence said would be there. 41 confirmed kills. The command post destroyed. The logistics waypoint eliminated. The route network disrupted at 3 points simultaneously. The after-action report cited the intelligence product from the combined program as the enabling factor for the operation's effectiveness. It did not cite individual patrol members. It cited the program. That was correct and insufficient simultaneously, which Kowalski was beginning to understand was the permanent condition of institutional documentation
in relation to operational reality. He wrote about it in his personal notes that evening, not with frustration, with the specific acceptance of someone who had made peace with a limitation rather than continuing to be surprised by it. The institutional record did what it did. The operational memory did something different. Both were necessary. Neither was complete. Hartley found him in the operations tent that evening, reading the Rifle Company after-action report for the second time. He poured 2 mugs of tea from the same battered pot and sat across from Kowalski and handed him one without asking. Kowalski drank it, still strong, still too hot. "The Rifle Company report," Hartley said.
Yes, sir. 41 confirmed. Yes, sir. Hartley drank his tea. In 90 days of the program, combined confirmed kills directly attributable to combined operations or intelligence product from combined operations, 112, against 8 Australian and 2 American personnel casualties, none fatal. Kowalski had not done the cumulative calculation. He did it now, quickly. That's considerably better than either element was producing independently. Considerably. Hartley set down his mug. The program continues beyond the original 4-month period. Task Force Commander has approved an extension, 6 additional months. I want to expand the fire support integration to 2 additional patrol elements, which means we need 2 additional American specialists. Kowalski looked at him. "You're scaling the program." "I'm scaling the program. The methodology works. The evidence supports expansion." Hartley paused. "The question is how to expand it without losing the relationship component that you identified as the decisive factor." "Consistent pairing. Same specialist with the same patrol element for the full duration. No rotation of the American personnel within the program." "Which means requesting specific individuals rather than accepting whoever the American Liaison Office sends." "Yes, sir." We need people who are technically capable and who have the patience to develop the relationship on the SAS timeline, rather than expecting it to develop on an American timeline. Hartley almost smiled again. It was becoming, Kowalski thought, slightly less rare. An American who operates on an SAS timeline. An American who understands why the SAS timeline exists and respects it enough to work within it while contributing what the American approach provides that the SAS timeline doesn't. "You're describing yourself." "I'm describing the type. I'm one example. There are others." Hartley picked up his pen and wrote something in the notebook he kept on the table in front of him during operational discussions. He wrote for a moment, then looked up. "The personal operational notes. The ones you shared with Sayers?" "Yes, sir." "I'd like to read them." Kowalski looked at him. "All of them?" "The sections on the relationship component, the trust as a primary decision factor, the conditions that produced the movement to the eastern position." Hartley held his pen. "I want to understand it from your perspective. I've read the official reports. I've conducted the formal debriefs. What I haven't read is your unfiltered account of what you observed in the patrol elements as the relationship developed." "Sir, the personal notes contain observations about specific individuals that are not sanitized for formal distribution." "I'm not asking for formal distribution. I'm asking to read them myself, to inform my understanding of what the program is producing that the official documentation cannot capture." Kowalski considered this for a moment. Hartley was asking for something unusual. Not inappropriate, but unusual. A senior officer requesting access to a junior officer's personal operational record because the senior officer believed it contained information the formal record had not preserved. It was, Kowalski thought, exactly the kind of request that demonstrated why Hartley was good at what he did. He was willing to seek information from sources that the formal system did not designate as primary,
because the formal system had a limitation, and he was honest enough to acknowledge the limitation and curious enough to go around it. "Yes, sir," Kowalski said. He gave Hartley the notes the next morning. 8 pages from the second patrol and 6 from the third. The sections on the relationship component marked with a folded corner so Hartley could find them without reading the technical fire support sections that would not be relevant to what he was looking for. Hartley read them that afternoon. He returned them the following morning with a single written comment on a separate piece of paper, folded inside the front page of the notes. Kowalski read the comment. It was 3 sentences. The movement to the eastern position was the correct tactical decision and would have been correct regardless of who made the fire support calls.
The reason it was possible was the reason you identified. The program should be designed to produce more instances of this, which means designing for the relationship, not the technical integration. Kowalski read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his personal notes, alongside the 8 pages it had accompanied. The notes stayed there through the remainder of the Vietnam tour, and the subsequent years, and the retirement, and the move to Virginia, and the War College, and the final retirement at 62. It was the most precise description of the program's central finding that anyone produced during the program's operational period, written by the officer who had spent 9 months developing the methodology that the program was built to complement, in 3 sentences, on a piece of paper that was never formally distributed and never formally cited. It was the operational memory in its purest form, accurate, honest, specific, and entirely outside the institutional record. Kowalski kept it because it was true, because the person who wrote it had earned the right to write it through 9 months of patient work in Phuoc Tuy province, and because it said in 3 sentences what the 47-page combined program after-action review, written 6 months later by an officer who had not been on any of the patrols, failed to say in its entirety. Design for the relationship, not the technical integration. That was the lesson. Everything else was context.